Hello, Peter Wilkin. Welcome to Everyday Anarchism.
Thank you, Graham. Pleasure to be here.
Essentially, I thought we could start with Orwell and then sort of your elaboration on the concept of Tory anarchism.
Certainly, when I first became interested in this, it was Orwell that was the key figure because he was the first one to really set out the concept of Tory anarchism. My interest in the subject was really that most of the characters in the book that I've written on the subject were people that I admired or whose work I enjoyed when I was growing up. But it never occurred to me that there was a particular connection between them. And it was only subsequently when I began to read more into them that I began to see this thread where most of these characters have been described by someone else or either by themselves as embodying this idea of a Tory anarchist. So that kind of left me intrigued as to what this might tell us about a particular strand of British culture, popular and culture really. And so that led me back to Orwell. Now, the interesting thing, I think, with Orwell is, you know, if you look at his essay on Swift, where he really first addresses this idea, you can see in the way he describes Swift so much of Orwell himself as a character. Many of the people that knew Orwell, his contemporaries, Richard Rees, George Woodcock, people of that era, that they felt that Orwell really did have that kind of outlook. And indeed, for many years, I think up until really he went to Spain and was caught up in the Spanish Civil War, he tended to describe himself to people he met as just a Tory anarchist. Now, whether he was saying that to provoke, I suspect, knowing his personality from what I've read, it wouldn't surprise me. And it was really Spain that led him to, I think, develop this idea that he believed in socialism, he said, because up until then, he liked the idea, but he didn't think it could ever really happen. But being in Barcelona, so he says, he thought for the first time socialism was possible. And after that, you see this character of George Orwell, I think, rather than Eric Blair, become more precise and developed. So I would say with Orwell, there's two strands to him. And I've written a paper on this, looking at how can Orwell, well known as a democratic socialist, how can he be classified as a Tory anarchist? Because it seems to be, a paradox. But he did, and he held to that view. Many Orwell scholars are actually very skeptical about this. I gave a presentation at a conference on Orwell on this subject, and at the end of it, the first question I got was, who are you to say that Orwell is a Tory anarchist? Well, I'm not saying that. He said it, and I just want to understand why he said it. And I think my view of it is that it's about that dichotomy between Blair and Orwell. That Blair, if you like, he characterizes the classic Tory anarchist background, upper middle class, shabby genteel, the landless gentry and so on, not part of the ruling class, but part of the kind of upper professional classes, scions of the empire and things like that. And that was Blair's background. That was what he was. He went into the colonial civil service, and for that very reason. But there was obviously this tension within him as he came to reject the empire and colonialism and to analyze it in his essays. And this other part of him, George Orwell, the campaigning journalist and writer, begins to emerge. So and Orwell for me is the democratic socialist, and Blair is the Tory anarchist. So that's how I think you can potentially reconcile this big contradiction in Orwell as a character.
There's many ways into this, starting with this term Tory anarchism. Listeners to the show have a good concept of anarchism by now, and I've got plenty of UK listeners, but most of my listeners are from the States or Canada, and I don't know about the Canadians, but we Americans, we don't have Tories, right? So the concept of Tory, you can substitute conservative for it, but it's not precise. If you are an American and you are thinking of Mitch Romney, Donald Trump, John McCain, I don't think any of these people are Tories. And so what is a Tory?
Yeah, well, the classic tradition of Tory and Whig in British politics dates back to the 18th century when, and as Orwell articulates in his writings on Swift, it's about the conflict between the progressive political forces as opposed to the conservative forces who want to keep things as they are largely. So Tory effectively was a term of abuse, meaning thief. So that, interestingly, and so that's the origins of that particular term. In terms of the USA, I mean, clearly the concept of a Tory anarchist in my work is an examination of that practice in Britain, but others have looked at it in other countries, you know, so in the US, figures like H.L. Mencken, for example, is often characterized in that way, or in France, Céline, the novelist. So I wouldn't make the case that it's necessarily just about what happens in British culture, although for me that's my primary interest. So as you say, with those figures you mentioned, none of them would be Tories in any conventional sense. And conservatism, I think, as a political movement has become such a strange phenomenon, embracing so many different conflicting elements, religious, secular, materialistic, and so on, that it becomes quite unwieldy. I mean, Evelyn Waugh, who I write about in the book, said of the problem with conservatism as a political movement is that it's never actually conserved anything. You know, there was a lack of conviction on the part of conservatives. And certainly if you look at that in the context of the characters you're describing, none of them seem remotely conservative. They may be reactionary, you know, in their views, but that's a different matter, I think. But in the context of British politics, historically, the Conservative Party would describe itself as the party of tradition, of patriotism, of defending traditional institutions, practices from the family to the village pub, you know, that these, if you like, become foundational in the structure of British social life. Therefore, we need to treat them with caution. And therefore, we also need to make changes in society very cautiously, because we don't know what we're going to disrupt or lose when we begin to overturn established practices and institutions. And that, I think, manifests itself a lot in the work of Tory anarchists, who are always critical in particular of the state and the state's desire to, you know, engineer a different kind of society. And so that's been a persistent theme, I think. And in that sense, there's a kind of conservative resistance to social engineering.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think the second episode of this podcast was about Tolkien, and he's a much less satirical figure. I mean, most of the figures that you discuss in your book are interested in satire, but Tolkien really did want to conserve something, and he really was opposed to the modern state, which he, you know, had all sorts of objections to. And so if you've been listening to this podcast since the beginning, I was trying to get at it from that very beginning, the way that Tory anarchist, maybe it doesn't totally make sense if we play it all out, but no ideology makes complete sense, but that it really speaks to some impulses we have, and impulses that, you know, a traditional leftist ideology and a traditional conservative or reactionary ideology can't really grasp. So someone who, like Tolkien, describes himself as an anarchist and wants to blow up the factories in the name of the forest while serving as a professor of, you know, Old English or philology with a pipe in a smoking room. He doesn't fit into our normal sense of left and right. And clearly this tradition that Orwell has identified also doesn't fit there, scrambles our categories a bit.
No, absolutely right. I think that it does. And what you're describing with Tolkien, he's often, I think, viewed as a kind of conservative anarchist because of that very outlook. But in a way, some of the things you're describing there, the desire that Tolkien says about, getting rid of the factories, that also manifests itself in aspects of British culture. You can look at people like, William Morris, for example, had a very critical view.
Another conservative anarchist in a certain way. Yes, fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I think he always saw himself as a revolutionary socialist, but at the same time, no. He came through that tradition with William Blake, of course, who certainly enunciated a rejection of industrial society as being necessarily progressive.
Mm-hmm.
You can see, which isn't to say that Blake wasn't, in some sense, enunciating the idea of making the world a better place. He clearly had visions about something like a kind of a socialist society, but he was extremely skeptical and scathing towards industrialization, the pollution of the countryside, the abuse of the environment, and the chaos and pollution of big cities. In a way, if you trace that story back through Blake and Morris, we're right where we are today with climate change crises, the logical outcome of those very processes that these figures were critiquing a long time ago.
Yeah, so I said I was going to start us with Orwell, but I can't resist where I've got us now, because it seems like Godwin and Burke come next, right? Before we get to Blake, and then we've got the birth of, Kropotkin says that Godwin is the birth of anarchism. The conservatives say, Kropotkin says that, yeah, Godwin is the birth of anarchism. Conservatives say that Burke is the birth of conservatism, and Godwin was so influenced by Burke. Then you've got these two traditions originating at the same time, both as responses to the French Revolution and perhaps both as responses to progressivism. And I don't find them easily separated, even though in so many ways they are different. It's these two intertwined traditions in a way that I think we're not comfortable with these days.
I mean, the story about anarchism or conservatism as political ideologies is told in different ways, and I wouldn't claim to be, giving you the definitive account. But my view of anarchism would be, if you go back to Godwin as a forebear, I suppose, and you could also factor in other figures like Thomas Paine, who was certainly
absolutely
very much about freedom of the individual, a minimalist state, promoting equality and social institutions. But for me, the anarchist tradition, when it develops really in the mid to late 19th century, that tradition seems to be one which comes, for me, it follows on logically from a kind of an Enlightenment view about using science and reason and experiments. Anarchists are very big on social experiments historically, building new communities or building little ghettos where you can set up a school or something like that. And I see, for me, that tradition that emerges and develops, I suppose, crystallizes in the 1870s, the First International, and those splits between the kind of the Marxian wing and the anarchist wing. That tradition for me comes out of the Enlightenment, and it seems a logical development, in the sense the Enlightenment is about questioning everything. Yeah, well, no one questions everything more rigorously than anarchists. And when they begin to do that, they actually turn those questions not just on traditional institutions in the state, but on capitalism and work and social life. And that tradition, it seems to me, is much more about the Enlightenment and the idea that ordinary people have the power to understand the world and make it better. Whereas I think that the Burkean tradition that you describe is, for me, is the counter or anti-Enlightenment, which is resistant to the idea that through reason you can rebuild and reorganize society. Do that at your peril, one might say. If you're a real Burkean conservative, be very careful about how bold or confident you are in your claim to understand how society works. And that tradition, I think, can lead in different directions. It can lead to deeply reactionary viewpoints. Someone like the late Israeli scholar Ziv Sternhell, who wrote a very good book, The Anti-Enlightenment, he clearly traces from Burke right the way through to deeply reactionary forces in the 20th century, the roots of fascism. Okay, well, clearly that's very different to the anarchist tradition.
Yeah.
Does it have to go that way? No, not necessarily. I think that you're quite right. If you look at Burke in another way, you can see anarchists like Colin Ward in the UK. I don't know if you're familiar with Ward's work. He's probably my biggest influence as an anarchist writer. And you can see certain connections in the way Ward talks about people forming little practices, communities, clubs, associations, networks to fulfill the needs that they have, that they're mutually supportive of each other. And that's something Burke makes a point about the little flotillas bobbing on the water, which are the things that make society function. And you can sort of see that link. But I think the fundamental difference between them would be that Burke, he's a contradictory. I mean, Burke was a supporter of Irish nationalism and independence and American independence.
Yeah, it's insane. He's so
but
tricky.
at the same time,
well, he was a Whig, if I recall correctly.
That's right. That's right.
So, like, if it's Whigs versus Tories, then Burke is on the wrong side both times, I suppose. So, sorry, carry on.
But just no, I was simply going to say, so you could, but at the same time, he wanted, I think, as a reaction to the French Revolution, to defend institutions. For, there's going to be a clear limit on the extent to which ordinary people can be brought into politics to take control and change society. So I think there's a limit with Burke as to how far that goes. But the point you just made about Burke being both on the one hand progressive and on the other hand reactionary, well, that's also Orwell's point about Swift, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Taking you back to where we started.
Yes.
He says this exactly about Swift, that here's someone who on the one hand, supports science and wants to solve social problems, but on the other hand, thinks that progress is kind of illusory. And that in effect, human beings are kind of condemned to repeat the same mistakes endlessly. And that, I think, is, you can see that characteristic with Burke. But for me, I think, so when I look at anarchism, just to summarize, I see the tradition as coming out of the Enlightenment, criticizing everything, the rights of people, being egalitarian and universal. And that clearly isn't a Burkean view. But I think it's the view that emerges generally in anarchism after the 1870s. But there are, of course, many variants within anarchism, and I'm not claiming that my view is the only way you can go.
Well, I think that's roughly right, and I think that there's places where you can find Kropotkin, Morris, and Burke agreeing in terms of the values of the past and preserving them. And then the place where Kropotkin is very different when he elucidates anarchism is this faith in scientific progress, which is something that I wrestle with. As it was a pre World War I, like so many people in the late 19th century who had a faith in scientific progress. After World War I, that gets really more difficult to hold on to, and we can leave it at that and return to Orwell unless you want to add anything else.
Just two things on that. I would say, although anarchists embrace, go back to Bakunin in the First International, anarchists kind of embraced science as a way of liberating working class communities. Through science, you can understand nature and society and challenge unjust institutions. But they were never naive about science. Bakunin also said, quite clearly, let's not put science on a pedestal whereby it becomes the new deity. Just as Proudhon had said to Marx about establishing a new international, let's not tear down all conventions only to set up a new one in its place. And so I think in that sense, although anarchists have generally accepted the importance of science, it's always been in a social context about changing the world and making it better. So you look at Kropotkin, something like fields, factories and workshops, this kind of vision of not exactly utopia. He's sort of saying, look, this is derived from things that people do, but it can be a different way of organizing society more broadly. And that, in a way, to me, that kind of synthesis of a kind of a social theory and an understanding of science and industry presents a picture of a much more decentralized, environmentally sensitive kind of anarchist society. And you can, again, I think there is that connection with someone like Kropotkin and Blake, you know, and going forward later anarchists, obviously like Murray Bookchin and so on, who wanted to take up this tradition. So although, yes, anarchists respect the importance of science in understanding the world as a way of emancipating working class communities, I don't think that they deify it, not at all, any more than they deify anything else. You know, it's interesting that anarchism, there are no, as far as I know, there's no sects, there's no Kropotkinians, there's no Bakuninians, you know, there's no Proudhonians. You know, anarchists have, it's not like other variants of ideology where one might be I don't know, a Marxist, say. That doesn't really happen with anarchism, not that I'm aware of, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it mostly doesn't, and I would certainly say it's not supposed to. So let's come back to Orwell, where we were supposed to stay, and I'm sorry I carried us over.
Oh, no, it's probably me. Yeah.
No, it was definitely me. So I think getting at this idea of Tory anarchism in Orwell gets to something that if you if you're just in popular culture, I assume it's like this in the UK, certainly in the States. Everyone, and I do mean everyone, is always describing their opponent's state interventions as Orwellian, right? Like, it doesn't really matter who is talking and what the other person is doing. If someone stands up and gives a speech and says, I would like the government to do this, you can find someone on the other side saying, oh, this is an Orwellian intervention. By Orwellian, they mean bad. They mean like 1984. And I think we have a temptation, if we know a little bit more about Orwell, when a conservative stands up and says, oh, look, the government wants to do this. It wants to make me use trans people's pronouns. How Orwellian. We sort of want to laugh at them and say, you know, that guy was a democratic socialist. But I think there's also a sense that as a Tory anarchist, the fact that he's got a ready-made critique for governmental programs makes sense. In other words, it's not that incoherent that you can use Orwell to criticize anyone's governmental policies if you understand these two sides of Orwell. And I wanted to see if you thought that is a way of making sense of how he's lived on as someone who is accessible to, it seems like, every political tradition.
Yeah, I mean, Orwell was very, not just in 1984, but in other writings, he was very aware and alarmed by the prospect of deepening totalitarianism. Clearly, his hostility to Stalinism was long established and was something that manifested itself in how he was treated by other socialists in the UK at the time. And he wrote a review of Friedrich Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, which you may be familiar with. And although he's critical of Hayek, he does concede that there's a concern here about how far the state's power can extend over society. And I think for someone like Orwell, his idea of socialism and the role of the state in that is a kind of a libertarian one, i.e., we need the state, but not doing too much. We need to make sure that health provision is national. We need to make sure that, you know, air pollution is regulated nationally. But I think he's much more part of that libertarian socialist tradition and outlook. And his concern about the extension of the state into social life, I think would probably mean that for Orwell, when he looks at socialism and the state and politicians, that socialism is a cultural transformation in society. It's not something that can be delivered by policy through the state. You know, elect this government, they're socialists, and then we'll all be socialists. I don't think Orwell's view of socialism was like that. Probably his view is more that, well, politicians, they can either help socialism or they can hinder it, but they can't make it. Socialism will only come when the working class have decided they've had enough capitalism and they want something else. And that will come through them. So I think he's part of that tradition which You know, Marx actually said, didn't he, at one point, that the emancipation of the working class will only be achieved by themselves. And I think Orwell's part of that tradition. So he's very suspicious. Certainly, by the time he's writing in the 30s, he's deeply suspicious of the way in which language has become a form of manipulation and power, as we know, which is why the concept of Orwellian is so widespread now. And for Orwell, the way in which language is used in politics as a means, particularly to scare people, to instill fear. So you see in 1984, you know, 2-minute hate. People around the telly worshipping Big Brother and screaming abuse. Well, that kind of idea in Orwell, which seemed perhaps at the time exaggerated, now seems perhaps more prescient with each passing year. But Orwell, as a Tory anarchist, like all Tory anarchists, he's a contrarian. So in that sense, it doesn't matter what you say, he'll probably try and find a way to challenge it and take an opposite position, even if ultimately he moves back. If you think about Orwell's views on World War II, up until the so-called end of the phony war, 1939 to 40, that kind of standoff between France and Germany, Orwell embraced pacifism. He was against the war. He said the war was a joke. You know, his essay Inside the Whale, we should just sit back and let this happen, and then we'll come out the other side. And then, of course, he writes his essay denouncing pacifism because he, you know, he says, "Oh, I had a dream last night, and I realised that was all nonsense." But that's characteristic of Orwell, these abrupt, sudden changes in outlook, you know, and that's also a Tory anarchist characteristic, I think, to be contrarian and to say something in part because you're seeking to provoke a reaction. And so when Orwell's writing about language and power, he's acutely sensitive to the way in which people use it as a kind of a political tool. And I think in many ways, it becomes perhaps the key concern of his political writings.
Yeah, and that again makes him, when it does seem like so many people want to change the world by changing language. Of course, this is a game that left-wing people play. I mean, I mentioned trans people, but the whole set of concerns, so many of them around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the sort of progressive movement. I work in a university, you work in a university. You know, there's always these questions of what language are we using, interrogating terms, all this stuff. And of course, you know, calling people welfare queens, right? Or making liberal an epithet or something like that. The conservatives are also trying to win the war of language. And so if everyone is trying to accomplish at least some part of their political views via shifts in language, then Orwell's critique of that sort of work becomes available to all of us, I think.
I think that's right. And it also illustrates a tension in the way in which language changes in society, which goes back to the point I was making about Orwell's view on the state and socialism. You know, can you bring about socialism from above? Can the state actively intervene to make people socialists? You know, by regulating language, for example. Yeah. Well, I think Orwell's view will be no. That changes in language tend to follow changes in habit and practice. Yeah. And that if you look in the UK now, and I think this is where the culture war, as it's so called, yeah. That's where it's being fought out, is that the right in politics don't like the fact that actually, you know, yeah, societies are still racist, but they're not as racist as they were 50 years ago. People don't say things that they would have said easily 50 years ago, because we kind of know that it's wrong. And that isn't about censorship. That's about the changes in people's values, about how they relate to other people. But for the political right, I think it's very important that they want to present that as a kind of censorship. But it's not. Language historically, like human societies, it changes. And what terms are acceptable at one period become rejected in a later period. And that seems to be what's happened. And it seems to be what this fight is about. And what's interesting, I think, is that for the political right, they want to seize the mantle of being defenders of free speech. And that is a shift, because historically the right have not been defenders of free speech. They've been opponents of free speech. And I think the reality is they still are. You know, what they're certainly not in support of freedom to protest in the streets as a form of free speech. But what they want is the right for people to say racist things. That's free speech. Okay. And I think that's where on the left, there's a real problem now, because some people on the left would say, yeah, okay, if racists want to say racist things, they should say it. And then we know you're racist. Others would say, actually, you can't say that because it's a form of harm. It hurts people. So you have to stop saying it. If you do, we're going to sack you or something like that. Yeah. And that's where the left, I think, is divided now. I completely do not accept that the right are sincere in their commitment to free speech any more than they're sincere in any commitment to the right to protest or anything like that. They're not. Yeah. But it's very convenient, I think, as a weapon with which to divide the left, and it's worked. And it will be interesting if Orwell were here as to where he'd stand on this. I'm pretty confident he would reject any sense of regulating language through the state or through institutions. I'm pretty confident that he would want to say language changes because people change in their communities, and which I think has happened. There were things when I was young, and probably when you were younger, which people would say, which they're much more hesitant to say now.
Yeah, I agree that it would happen. I think it's good. I also think Orwell's critique fundamentally is correct. The easy example, and is much lower stakes than outright racism, is I teach at the University of North Carolina, and there was a campaign about 20 years ago. I think it started about 20 years ago. A woman high up somewhere decided that nothing would ever be the freshman anything ever again. It would all be first year. So everything is first year. And I say first year like, oh, I teach first year classes, etc. And then I had some of my students do, they made videos and they interviewed their fellow students about topics around campus. And the first thing they said to the students was, hey, what year are you? And not a single student of the 30 or so first year students that were interviewed said, I'm a first year. They all said, I'm a freshman. Men, women, everything. And so I just thought, I have nothing against, I'm happy to say first year, I'll keep saying first year, but it didn't work. Like the fact that some dean decided that we don't say freshman anymore had absolutely no impact on the students' views. And so in that respect, that's not probably a good use of our energy, if that makes sense, our institutional energy. On the other hand, I certainly don't think it does any harm to call our classes first year classes. And I would be upset if a conservative said that we're doing something bad by doing so, but it simply didn't have any effect. And if you wanted to affect that change because you thought it was important, it had to be something besides an email sent out to all of the chairs. It has to come from below.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, in the UK, it's slightly different. The tradition is freshers and first years. So actually it's both. But it's not freshmen. That's I always think of that as being a more fundamentally an American way of describing things. But in the UK, it's slightly different. But of course, the role of language in institutions and the jargon that proliferates now, that Orwell, when he wrote his essay on the politics of the English language, is quite clear about this. Unclear language reflects unclear thinking, and probably that you're trying to hide something. And more broadly, he saw, that kind of language as being part of the trend towards totalitarianism, speaking in ways which are opaque and unclear, confusing, and that people can't understand as a way of trying to control people. So, we see that on a very micro and small scale level, I think, in all kinds of institutions, whether they're private companies or whether they're, universities. Graham, sorry, I haven't really talked about the concept of Tory anarchism and what I think it means.
It does seem like we should talk about that, doesn't it? Since we're heading towards the end. Yes,
I was conscious of actually not getting to that point. So maybe I should just give a brief summary of that.
Thank you for hosting. Sorry about that.
No, not at all. For me, when I've written about Tory anarchism in Britain, I see it as embodying a particular kind of character, usually from an upper middle class background, which means wealthy, privileged, but not aristocracy, not the super rich, probably coming from the professions, colonial civil service, law, magistrates, the army. And it's usually associated with characters who have both an aesthetic leaning in some sense, which lends itself perhaps towards satire or journalism, but also people who are in some sense rebellious and willing to take a stand on things, hence the contrarianism. So there's a sense, as Orwell said of Swift, that the Tory anarchist is at war kind of with everyone. And therefore, the Tory anarchist embraces some modern things, but at the same time, doubts that they can come true. He believes in progress, or she believes in, well, actually, I say that, but there is an important gender issue here, in that I think by and large, Tory anarchists have tended to be men. When I looked into, there were some characters I considered and rejected, like P.G. Wodehouse or Noel Coward, who have a certain resemblance. But there were no women that I could think that fitted this. And I think that's to do with the social background of most of these people.
I wanted to ask, when I was reading that part of your book, and I don't know her very well, but does Dorothy Sayers fit this in any way?
I know why you say that. No, I mean, she's a bit like Wodehouse. I think she's too nice. No, when you read Wodehouse, he's astonishingly funny and his characters are wonderful, but you don't ever think any of them as being, if they're foolish, if they're foolish like Wooster, they're still amiable and likable. You could still imagine having a cup of tea with them. But in the hands of a Tory anarchist, when they stick the knife in, they want to cut. Yeah. And I don't think you would say that about people like Sayers or Wodehouse or Noel Coward. They don't have the same. That's why I say a Tory anarchist, there's an element of risk involved and a certain edge. And interestingly, on this, I spoke with a character who you may not know called Roger Law, who's an artist in Britain. And Roger Law was one of the people who created the puppets for a show called Spitting Image. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. It's very popular. No, in the mid-80s to the mid-90s. It was kind of, you'll find it on YouTube. It was a hugely popular satirical show using specially made puppets to mock the royal family, politics, and so on. And Roger Law, he was a young man who was at university at the same time as Peter Cook, who I think is a self-styled Tory anarchist. And he became friends. He said, I was seduced by Cook. He was a dandy. He was witty. He was urbane. He was sophisticated. He was brilliant. And he was great fun. And I spoke with Roger Law a couple of times about what he made of Cook and his politics and being a Tory anarchist. And he said, well, part of it is Tory anarchists, they like to cause trouble and they like to arse around and put the knife in and see what happens. But he also, and this interested me, he said, but you have to be careful because there's also something deeply reactionary at the heart of Tory anarchism. And I kind of puzzled about that until I began to look at people like Céline in France. I don't know if you've read any of Céline at all or know much about him.
I haven't. I mean, I'm vaguely familiar. I know the name. That's about as far as I can go.
Probably, bearing in mind this is France, he's probably the most controversial French writer of the 20th century. And to give you a flavour of why he's controversial, during the period of the phony war between France and Germany, the Nazis had a committee to look into potential collaborators in post-invasion France. And the only conclusion the report could reach was that the only figure in France that's a real Nazi is Céline. So that's not something you'd necessarily want to put on your CV as a reference, but it gives you a sense of why Roger Law was saying, actually, Tory anarchism, it's playful, it's mean, it's funny, it's provocative as a stance, but there's also something quite reactionary about it as well. And that, I think, is the misanthropic aspect of it, which Orwell locates in Swift. This sense that in the end, everything's rotten, we're pretty rotten, and no matter how hard we try to make things better, we're going to mess it up for that very reason. And I think that's, if you like, the black hole at the heart of Tory anarchism.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it seems to me that that's where Tolkien doesn't fit into this.
Yeah. There's a romanticism in Tolkien, isn't there?
Yes, precisely, which might accord a little bit more with William Morris
Yeah,
than it does with George
definitely.
Orwell. And then I do think, you've really hit on something, which is to say, and this gets back to the idea that everyone likes to throw Orwell around when they're critiquing their opponent. First of all, Tory anarchism is funny, it is sharp, it is smart, and secondly, it is, even if it maybe wouldn't work like as a program, it certainly doesn't have a program. It is every social movement, every group has inconsistencies, hypocrisies, places where you can put the knife in. And it seems like when it comes down to it, the Tory anarchists' greatest desire is to put the knife in. And that's why anyone can pick up that knife.
Yeah, I think that that's right. And to be clear, for me, Tory anarchism is not in any sense an ideology. I think I describe it in the book as a stance, a posture that one adopts in society, becoming a public figure, becoming a part of popular and public culture, so that you can make that attack on the things that you think need to be attacked. And usually it's directed, not always, but usually more often than not, it's directed against those in power, which of course historically is the real satirical tradition, going back to Juvenal, a depiction of decaying, corrupt and decadent elites who have ruined society. And I think that is a persistent theme in the work of most Tory anarchists. So it's not in any sense a political ideology, it's a stance, it's a posture. I also think it's quite exclusive. I don't think anyone can be a Tory anarchist. I think it does reflect certain social characteristics, class, gender, this aesthetic quality, I think I have in the book a snippet from a TV series called Monkey Dust, which I say has a family resemblance to Tory anarchism. And in one episode on Monkey Dust, they're satirizing a kind of DIY manuals where you too can become a great author overnight. And then the heading for the advert is great literature. Anyone can do it, And I don't think that's true. And I think that the point about Tory anarchists as this peculiar, eccentric form of contrarianism is that not anyone can do it, but they can because they have that aesthetic edge and that ability to be heard in public, which goes with it, which enables them to, as you say, stick the knife in.
Yeah, well, that was your phrase, but I'm just borrowing it.
Yeah.
I want to say, there's one more thing that I want to make sure that we talk about. I pulled up this quote. I just Googled it, so hopefully it's right. But this is a famous quote from The Road to Wigan Pier. One sometimes gets the impression that the mere words socialism and communism draw towards them with magnetic force every fruit juice drinker, nudist, sandal wearer, sex maniac, Quaker, nature cure quack, pacifist, and feminist in England. And I wanted to know if you think that this fits into the Tory. So there's this celebration, it seems to me, from Orwell of, and when Jacqueline O'Donnell was on the show talking about Oscar Wilde and how Oscar Wilde, is a figure that Orwell perhaps could have or should have admired, but also Orwell didn't admire him in part because of the queerness. There it does seem to be a celebration of something very conventional. It's a conventional working class masculinity that Orwell is celebrating against those, fops who are, drinking fruit juice and calling themselves Quakers. And I'm wondering if that's the reactionary edge that you're talking about, but I wanted to get your thoughts.
I think it is. It's also about the provocation, because it's going out into the public domain. He wanted to provoke socialists, I think, because he saw the impact of Stalinism on socialist culture as being so damaging that he wanted to do that. But yes, that quote is a very famous one. It fits entirely the Tory anarchist outside of Eric Blair, I would say. And the interesting thing is that the people, and I should hasten to add, Orwell had his own prejudices. He was aware of them. He knew he was in some sense, anti-Semitic, although he didn't want to be, but that reflected the class he was from. He knew he was unsympathetic to homosexuals, yeah? So he was aware of those prejudices, but nonetheless he had them. And when you've got them, it can be difficult, as we all know, to get rid of them. But one interesting aspect of Orwell's character, I think, is, as you say, he set these kind of fops up to demean them and attack them. And he notes it in a number of places that when he actually meets figures, Stephen Spender, for example, who was a British poet, who Orwell savaged, George Woodcock, Alex Comfort, pacifists. These are the kind of people he's dismissing and sneering at, sandal-wearing, muesli-munching, Quakers. But he said, once I met them, when we sat down and had a beer and chat, I found I really liked them. And that, I think that's interesting. So there's a sense in which it's always easier to attack an abstraction than it is a concrete person. And Orwell, in his experience and his writing, he kind of manifests that. And he was big enough to be able to say, yeah, I said these bad things about people like Spender and Comfort and Woodcock and others, but actually I became good friends with them. And I think that shows the kind of the sense in which Orwell's contrarianism was for public consumption, much more than it was about what he actually came to believe about these characters.
Okay,
but yeah,
great.
he did address a kind of, I suppose, in his own way, a kind of a sense of a conventional masculinity that he thought was being more true to working class culture than this kind of middle class eccentrics or fops, as you described it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sympathetic. I mean, I'm sort of tying myself in knots just trying to think through this. I'm sympathetic to the idea that so many of us who are, on the left or in the left in universities can get so caught up in language and in cultural concerns and categories that we can kind of miss what the people who are actually at the bottom of the system really need. I also think that there's a long tradition in socialism of setting aside various groups as not really counting and not really mattering, and the women, the Jews, the homosexuals, whatever, they're not real socialists, they belong over there. And I don't view that as hypocritical. These are two things that must both be taken into account of, and I guess that's one of the reasons why we have the Tory anarchists, because they can point this sort of thing out to us, even if, as you say, they're certainly not going to give us any sort of route forward or any sort of synthesis that will let us make something.
Yeah, I mean, on the first point about universities and language and as you say, people on the left in university, it's never occurred to me that socialism will be achieved through universities. It's always seemed to me that it's going to be a manifestation of what working class people want. They're the majority after all, and if they don't want it, it's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. But the important point is precisely about debate and I wouldn't say propaganda, but being able to articulate ideas as to why it would be a step forward from where we are. In terms of diversity and socialism, I think you're right that historically, certainly the way socialism evolved tended to be much more rooted in a very male sense of the labour movement and political parties, often dominated by cliques, and that's still the case in many instances. But I would assume that for most, most socialists should certainly in the libertarian socialist tradition, would want to recognize the importance of diversity and difference. That a good society is one where people, pursue their particular interests and differences wherever it takes them. That's what makes society interesting, as opposed to this idea that Orwell articulates in 1984, that Evelyn Waugh describes in Love Among the Ruins, that the state can engineer a particular kind of character and person, and in effect create subjectivities rather than allow people to produce them through their own experiments and their own movements and so on. And I think that's that aspect of the libertarian socialist tradition that Orwell is a part of, I think, about social experiments. However much he disparages sandal-wearing, muesli-munching eccentrics, nonetheless, he's also that himself. He does that too. So I think that is a tension in the kind of socialist tradition. And the good thing about Tory anarchists in general is that they target everyone. They do critique everyone, including their own failings.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, as we're heading towards the end of our time, I was thinking about asking you something along the lines of, what is Tory anarchism good for? And it seems like you've sort of given that answer. I mean, I want to suggest that it's a lot of fun. Obviously, if if George Orwell, Jonathan Swift, and Monty Python are Tory anarchists, then obviously the Tory anarchists are funny and enjoyable. But then it also seems like the critical role they provide is vitally important, and also now I'm just sort of parroting you, and also dangerous in a certain way, or it's dangerous to get too caught up in it.
It is, if you embrace the misanthropic aspect that's at the heart of it, then certainly for progressives, that's a problem, and I think Orwell was aware of that. That's why when you read his personal memoir on Spain, it does seem like he had some kind of real revelation there when he's sort of saying, well, wow, socialism is actually a real thing. I thought it was just a story we were telling each other to keep ourselves warm in the dark, but it's real. And you can sort of see that shift in him, I think, as a consequence of that. But in general, amongst Tory anarchists, I think there's a much more sardonic tone to their work, which kind of says, look, we're all gonna mess up, make mistakes. We're all pretty, and at heart, it's worse than that. As Roger Law was trying to alert me to, there's something much more reactionary as well, which says people are pretty rotten, but we can still laugh at them. That's good. So that's the danger, I think. It's useful because, any free society has to be able to tolerate dissent, criticism, satire, and so on. And they certainly give us that in a way which is, and this is important, I think, very popular and has reach.
And without the Tory anarchists, it would be very hard to find the satires of the Tories that we really need, because progressive satires of Tories tend to not be, on the mark. One of the marks of satire doesn't work unless you really get the thing you are satirizing. So the progressives can't satirize the Tories, not really, and the institutional Tories, the non-anarchists, are not going to satirize themselves, and so the Tory anarchists are performing this vital function.
It's true, and I think we live in an age now where satire is a pervasive part of popular culture. Television shows, chat shows, quiz shows, game shows, everything is satire. And when you watch it, you feel that the meaning of satire has been completely eroded and lost. There's no edge to this, and bearing in mind always the limits of satire. As Peter Cook once said, oh yes, satire is such a powerful weapon. That's why the Berlin cabarets managed to stop the rise of the Nazis in the 1920s. And that's true. It's true. But you feel somehow that contemporary satire is very manufactured, and you wouldn't say that about Tory anarchists. They are much more autonomous and independent, and they would resist the idea of being manufactured and sold by a kind of corporate institution, I think. Whereas a lot of contemporary satire, it just is. Okay, you can almost see the people that are producing the show sitting around a table going, right, folks, we've got to get this show Saturday night, 30 minutes. It's going to be a satirical show, weekly news headlines. Who do we get on it? Oh, yeah, these 4 people, they're all hot. They cover the bases. Let's get them on. They can do a few puns, one-liners. It seems very formulaic. Whereas I think the Tory anarchist approach to satire was to be resistant to formula and to try and challenge it.
Okay, excellent. Artisanal satire from the Tory anarchists.
I think that's right.
Yeah, I mean, That brings us back to William Morris. All right, Peter, this was wonderful. Anything else you would like to add?
No. I think we've covered a wide range of things here. Obviously, we could talk endlessly, but I don't want your viewers to switch off, as you say they might do. So yeah, we can stop there. And if you receive massive hits this show and want to follow up, you can always get back to me, and that would be absolutely fine.
Yeah. I mean, massive hits, I don't know, but a follow up someday sounds lovely. I'd love to dig into Evelyn Waugh and all sorts of things, and maybe I'll try and convince you in the future that Dorothy Sayers really, I mean, I do think there's something misanthropic in Dorothy Sayers if you read enough of her, but we can say this for another
Maybe
day.
I need to look at her, and thank you for that steer. It's worth me going back to that.
She's brilliant, if nothing else.
Yeah,
She's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Peter. Such a pleasure.
Yep, for me too. Take care, Graham.
You too. Bye now.
Bye.